Buddhism, Muslimism, and Christianity are the three great international, interracial religions. They have broken through the various boundaries of race and caste to become powerful forces in the world as world beliefs. Therefore, the bringing together of these into some kind of an harmonious pattern could well be a determinant in the future of our world and our culture. Zen, to Dr. Suzuki, simply represents the gradual development of personal integration. An integration that does not lean upon externals, and an integration that is gradually cleansed of the tremendous ulterior forces which have a tendency to destroy the validity of works. You will remember that at the very beginning of Christianity, the Christian mystic was a more or less dedicated person. He was vowed to poverty. He was vowed to an unselfish life of dedication. He was not supposed to own things. He was never under any condition to use his faith as a means of improving his own estate. He was to recognize the importance of the words of Jesus, that the one who would be the greatest among us, let him be the servant of all. Christianity, in its deepest, most mystical sense, was a religion of service. It was a religion of sharing and of giving. It was a religion of modesty and of conscience. And it would protect its followers against many of the great vices of the Roman Empire and later of the medieval extravagance of Europe by requiring of these followers a very simple, monastic, detached way of life. Somewhere along the line, this simplicity was lost. Somewhere along the line, Christianity moved from a foundation of good works to an increasingly ambitious position in world affairs. Little by little, the glories of the church began to exceed the virtues of the church. And after a while, deeply involved in world politics, the church became itself a political instrument. It became a great accumulator of wealth. It began to take a greater and greater part in mundane affairs. It produced at one time a great many cardinals and great leaders who were never even priests or monks, but were simply political persons raised to the cardinal's red while still in their teens. This type of situation could not but undermine the simple purpose of religion, and to place the individual in a highly combative, highly aggressive relationship in which it became more and more necessary for him to be astute in statesmanship and less necessary that he be a virtuous human being. This has been the story all the way along. It might have been the story among Buddhist peoples also, had it not been that, generally speaking, they did not have the physical opportunities for such a rapid motion toward materialism. There is plenty of materialism in Asia today, but this is not going to solve Asia's problem any more than it has solved the problems of the Occident. And Dr. Suzuki is convinced that a few mystics like Buddha, Meister Eckhart, and the founders of the various Zen sects of Japan were very clear in giving us certain advice, certain suggestions, certain ways of thinking, which could be of the greatest value to us. Now, there is another point that we have to take into consideration at this stage in our thinking. If man was a permanent guest here, if he was going to remain on this earth with his present equipment and his present faculties and his present interests for 1,000 years even, or more generally 10,000 years, there might be some reason for the long-range strategy that he tries to build in a short-ranged life. If it was possible for a man to build a vast enterprise and to become master of wealth and authority in this world, and could then continue the advancement of his project indefinitely, there might be some more obvious reason for his tremendous aggressiveness. But what is his aggressiveness? It is really little more than a tempest in a teapot. That which he so aggressively accumulates, his descendants will, with equal aggressiveness, waste and spend. The empires which men build may not even survive them, and if so, soon become decadent. In the very hour in which the individual, struggling aggressively for his own achievement, is in the process of achieving, and a host of bacteria are undermining him, there is no permanence here. The path of ambition ended for Adolf Hitler in a bunker in Berlin, and it ended for Mussolini along a road in northern Italy. Regardless of the ambition, it is not capable of fulfillment. Consequently, this vast aggressiveness, this tremendous grasping for power, is a grasping after a shadow that disappears even as you take hold of it. So actually, the case in favor of aggressiveness is a poor one. We may say, however, of course, that our aggressiveness will build foundations for others who come after us. We inherited the aggressiveness of the past. How grateful are we? Is the past as a burden upon us something that we are thankful we have inherited, or is it a nuisance from the beginning? Is what we are handing over to the next generation today as the result of our own ceaseless struggle? Are we handing the future anything but a disaster? What is this tremendous aggressiveness producing? What foundation have we for it? Perhaps psychologically it would be well to admit right now that most of this tremendous aggression is nothing but psychic acidosis. The individual is uncomfortable. He is miserable. He is sick. He is frustrated in the simplest things of life. Therefore, he turns to aggression largely as an escape from reality. If this same man, who is now building a tremendous career, which will end with his own death, and his own death will come the sooner as his career becomes more intensive, this individual, would he be what he is? Would he be striving for what he is striving? If he possessed within himself certain convictions, certain values, and was able to live a truly contented, integrated life. If this man had a good family that understood him and he understood them, a close, deep family relation, if he had a good group of simple friends, if he had a few creative interests in art, music, or literature, if he had a reasonable degree of self-control in habits and in temperances, if he had a simple working philosophy of life that gave him the joy of simple achievement in the warm atmosphere of affection and regard, would he be interested in this dramatic achievement? Western people shake their heads, say, oh, it would be tragic. Think of a man so happy that he couldn't build a career. Think of an individual who would be drowned in the dismal negation of Asia, when in reality he could have gone out and killed himself in 6 easy stages. But the truth remains that this man going out and killing himself for the fulfillment of his own ambition is perpetuating a cycle of situations. And when enough people do this, Western civilization becomes a chaos in which there is no security for anyone. And the individual is no longer struggling to succeed, he is struggling to prevent himself from drowning. But wherever it is, the struggle goes on. Somewhere in our way of life, there has to be a new sense of value. In the book of Revelation, it is written that there shall be a new heaven and a new earth, and the old heaven and the old earth shall be no more. We're getting to the point where we're very much in need of this new heaven and this new earth. We are in need of a new kind of understanding of spiritual value, heaven, and a new kind of organization of material problems, earth. There has to be not a continual patching, a continual effort to rescue something from the dismal condition which it has earned for itself. There has to be somewhere a clear-cut understanding which will give us an entirely new orientation toward living. Of course, Dr. Suzuki suggests modestly Zen. And if we accept by Zen not just an Oriental doctrine, but a thinking about things, we will discover, as he did, that we have had Zen in the West. We not only had it in the case of Meister Eckhart, we came very close to having it in certain of the works of Nietzsche. We have come very close to having it in a great many things that have affected our way of life. It is very obvious in certain aspects of the Platonic dialogues. It comes back to us in the great Christian mystics like St. Francis de Assisi. It is evident everywhere that beneath the surface of our way of life there has been this stream of mystical apperception. And it is this mystical apperception which is just another term for Zen. For Zen is simply an attitude toward things. And either we have to get an attitude that is worthwhile and live it, or we will undoubtedly drift further and further into a condition which is today almost unbearable. So Zen, with its composure, with its quietude, frightens the West. But if we are terrified at being quiet, the East is terrified at the noise that we are making. It is terribly concerned that our ways are going to more and more penetrate into Eastern society in the wrong way. This penetration is already on. It has been keenly felt in Japan. And at the present time, thoughtful persons no longer go to Tokyo, which is a great modern metropolis. They retire quietly to Nara or Nikko or Kyoto, where the old ways continue. Tokyo today is becoming more and more like a great Western city, and that means that it is becoming a more confusing, difficult, and unrewarding place every day. It is now a great center of business. It is not a center of culture. The Orient doesn't like to see this happening either. It does not like to see its young people take on the worst of us. It is not happy to have our motion pictures, our theater, our literature transforming its younger generation into a problem generation, largely concerned with competitions in bubble gum. This is not what they are looking for. Something has gone very sour in cultural interchange. We constantly talk about bringing culture, but what we bring is not culture. So there must be an international understanding on this matter somewhere along the line. An understanding which will help all good people to preserve what is good in their own way of life and not continually undermine each other in the name of progress, in the name of dynamics, and in the service of uncontrolled ambition. Uncontrolled ambition destroyed Japan 20 years ago. Undestroyed ambition will continue to destroy the nations and peoples of the world. And it comes right straight down into our own personal lives, into our homes, into our families. For we are still, as individuals, heavily indoctrinated by the Western concept that life is a great struggle for individuality. That the individual must be himself, and no one has paused to find out whether this self was worth being or not. So the individual becomes himself and at the same time an international nuisance. There is no discrimination as to what is worthwhile about self, what is valuable, what is necessary, what is purposeful. So in the desperate effort to be free, we are only achieving intellectual, moral, and physical license. Then we resent the laws which are forced upon us. Until today, there are so many laws we cannot even remember them. But each of these laws arises out of some error of human conduct, something that we do that is dangerous to others. And laws must be passed to protect us from ourselves and each other. So Zen comes in with this very definite thinking taken from world mysticism. The individual has at the source and root of himself the only answer that he will ever know to his own problem. Man is not born a derelict. He is not shipwrecked before he comes into birth, nor is he born into a world whose misfortunes inevitably destroy his own rights of achievement. The individual is born into a world which he has the right to use, and according to our way of thinking, the right to abuse. And the most important thing in the life of every individual, also man has been given faculties and powers and energies with which to advance the proper destiny of himself, and in so doing to achieve the proper destiny for all men. The person is equipped to be a person. Yet in this struggle as we know it, these values are continuously lost in something that is not real and something that is not valuable. Today it would seem that the only solution to our problem is the final crash of a collapsing civilization. It seems as though we must come finally to this Götterdämmerung, this twilight of the gods, which in the old Nordic rites brought Valhalla, Asgard, and the three worlds down into a flaming oblivion, above which finally rose the tides of the eternal sea. It looks as though perhaps the only answer is that man must crash completely, that the world that he has built without any real thoughtfulness or without any real attentiveness to the consequences of his own actions must ultimately bring him down in common ruin before he will accept the simple fact. Of all stubbornness, this is the most aggressive and dangerous kind. It is perhaps only in this way that the new heaven and the new earth can come about. No one seems to have the courage or the strength to break away from the existing pattern. Yet this break is not the terrible stress that we think it is. It takes much more ill-guided courage to continue to make the mistakes than it would to stop. Yet we do not seem to have even enough self-control left to stop the process of hurting ourselves. And this applies to the individual. A large part of our daily conduct is simply making us miserable. But we haven't the courage to stop doing what hurts us. Perhaps we haven't the available insight to realize what is wrong. We have so externalized our lives that when things go wrong, we blame everyone, but never ourselves. We seem to feel that our destiny is linked totally to a political situation or to an economic situation, and that nothing that we can do will make any difference. This is all defeatism, and it is also profound ignorance. How any people with the largest group of well-educated citizens in the world can be so woefully deficient in the first principles of knowledge to believe that there's nothing you can do about this, that perhaps is the most astonishing phenomenon of all. Because actually, this great acceptance, the acceptance of the inevitability of stress, which is common to Western peoples, can only be sustained by total blindness. There is no way in which you can justify this position by any kind of basic thinking of any type. We must simply ignore everything we claim to believe in order to arrive at this negative conclusion. Certainly there is something we can do about anything. We do not necessarily mean by this that we can dispense with Mr. Castro overnight, or that the Russians are going to suddenly turn into a benevolent society. We do not mean this. But what we do mean is that we as individuals can come into an harmonic adjustment with our world. We can come to recognize its faults and recognize its virtues. We can learn the lessons that it has to teach. We can live good, constructive, useful lives. We can meet the future with a good hope, simply by beginning to understand ourselves and the principles upon which life is built. These principles are probably as well expounded in Zen as anywhere else today, and it is rather good that they should have a contemporary spokesman. We all respect the Sermon on the Mount, but it was long ago. We respect the life of St. Francis, but we doubt if he could live it today. We respect the philosophy of Meister Eckhart, but not one American in a million has ever heard of him. We regard and revere the heroic lives of great people of our own time, but these do not touch us as they should. So perhaps the fact that there is somewhere in the world a living faith, vitally sustained by solidly convinced people, and that this faith has some of the elements that we need. Perhaps this helps to make it a contemporary thing. And we have to realize that whatever it is being lived by contemporary people. And the one point about Zen that has always seemed most interesting to me is that while it is one of the most subtle of all philosophies, and strangely one of the most mystical, that in Japan it has been largely held by the military class. It was the consolation for the soldier. In China, the nearest parallel to Zen, which is Taoism, was also very largely the religion of the businessman. Now here's mysticism dominating the life of the soldier in Japan, and mysticism dominating the life of the merchant, the shopkeeper, the businessman, the aggressive buyer and seller in China. Now, between the military aggressiveness of Japan and the industrial aggressiveness of the Chinese merchant, we have an environment of circumstances not so distant from our own. Here, the tremendous aggressiveness of man and his constant instinct to merchandise, perhaps these could be peculiarly reached by a philosophy that has been most successful everywhere with this group, or these groups. Now, why would Zen become the most important to a soldier? I think most of the boys of our own group who are in foxholes know the answer. Zen is a philosophy of a dynamic adjustment to inevitables. The soldier with a most uncertain future, facing death and pain almost every moment, separated from all the comforts and consolations of his normal life, living in constant hazard, is in the most immediate need of the most dynamic conviction. And it is only by some such conviction that he can sustain himself. The general life of the soldier is today the life of Western man. We live as he did and does, under a constant insecurity. We live as he does, under a pressure of circumstances that appear dictatorial and arbitrary, but against which he cannot rebel. We live almost as he does, whether it is in a foxhole or a fallout shelter. We are faced with his insecurities. Therefore, he needs something that gives him a dynamic adjustment to a total plan, gives him an insight into a good that transcends life and death, and something which he can immediately apply to his inner consciousness with some form of satisfying results. In other words, he has to utterly face this sense of transiency, which is everywhere in our way of life. We don't realize it, but we are in exactly his position. So he is looking for immediate vitality of spiritual centeredness. Now, what happens when an individual moves more or less deeply into his own center? The Zen in meditation, or the meditative concept of this non-aggressive way of life, what happens? If a person finds his own center, finds his own core of life, and becomes aware of it, this individual has a new kind of courage that is not aggressive, but is eternal. The individual who is convinced of value and serves value is beyond temptation. And temptation is our big problem. It follows almost inevitably that the individual who has achieved an internalization is stronger than a person who has only outward supports. The person of wealth is weak when he loses his money. The individual with authority is meaningless if he loses his job. The individual with all forms of physical security is insecure if they are taken from him. All these things, depending upon circumstances, force us to view that circumstances today are unpredictable. Thus, these things do not lead to strength. They lead to fear, to worry, to doubt. And the accumulation of them at a desperate pace is the most complete expression of selfishness that we know. Let us assume, rather, that this individual, fully aware of his responsibilities and by no means intending to depart into some nirvanic sphere, simply faces the simple problem of striving after immediate value. Value in the sense of these things which will protect him. How much less man could earn and how much more he would have if he did not have to spend most of what he makes correcting his own mistakes. How much better off we would be if the national health improved 50 or 75%. How much more money would we have if we did not have to constantly seek medication and psychological help for problems we should never have? These things strike right at the very core of Zen. So let us think for a moment how we could apply this to our own immediate problem. Let us take the Zen attitude of absolute nihilism for a second. Let us admit that this whole existence that we know is nothing but an extension of our own faculties, that it is nothing but our own thoughts and emotions fashioning out of substances around us merely the likeness of our own intensities, that these goblins, whether they be mystical, psychological, political, or economic, are simply demons created out of our own fear, out of our own ignorance, out of our own selfishness. If we would simply stop at some moment energizing and vitalizing phantoms that have no existence whatever, we might have a little time to examine facts. The facts of life are very simple. Perhaps it is an oversimplification to use Bernard Shaw's remark, man is born, man suffers, and man dies. But this is perhaps the most substantial definition that we have of life. Outside of these facts, man has to create his life. He has to create within the pattern of inevitables. He has to create these things which will be most suitable to his own needs and add the greatest amount to his own serenity of spirit. If he worked with these problems collectively and individually, he probably would have no wars. But he cannot quite energize his own consciousness in these respects. He waits for other people to do it. Well, during the World War II, we had an epidemic of limitations and restrictions on various commodities, including gasoline, and it became a popular slogan, "Is this trip necessary?" There is something Zen in this particular pause that could very well refresh and also eliminate an unnecessary trip. Today, when we look at life and look at the things that we do, are these things necessary? And what constitutes necessity? Necessity is not justified by a blind impulse within ourselves to do these things. Necessity is not based upon the fact that other people do them. Necessity is only based upon one factor alone, that through the doing of them, something of permanent value is achieved. There is a reason to read a good book if we learn from it. There is a reason to live with great art if it enriches our souls. But there must be a good come out of anything, or it is not necessary. On this basis alone, we'd simplify life 50%. Each person who takes upon himself something of integration gains a quietude that enables him to act from himself instead of from pressure. This is one of the secrets of Zen. In Zen, there is always time to do things graciously, to do things beautifully, and to do things in a kindly way. This pause, this element of the sudden discovery of time, reminds us that our whole concept of time is our own also. That this rushing from here to there is not a concept of real time, but that time is something we have to win back from the pressures of our own personality. But that until man takes time to consider, time to think, time to analyze his words before he speaks them, time for gracious and kindly things, time for understanding and family and friends. Until man rescues this time, what has he? Zen says that he has to have this. For the last 50 years, we have been creating conveniences to free man so that he would have more time. But because of his own internal nature, this time has become a menacing force in his life, and he must waste it as rapidly as he can because he cannot live with it. Zen would move into these things. In many respects, Zen is perhaps the most advanced psychology we know today. For it is the only psychology that we do know that will go to the root of human character and simply say, this has to be done. It is not a matter of adjusting man to his world. It is the problem of adjusting man to himself. And the individual who to himself is true cannot then be false to any man. And it is to find this trueness. It must be found in quietude, in relaxation, and in integration. It must come through the simplification of life. It must come through the individual gradually manifesting from within himself the beauty that is there, rather than allowing his psychic toxins to surround his life with impossible situations. The individual who has achieved this core integration is practically indestructible. Not only that, but his pressures will always be in the direction of the common needs. He can be captured, but he can never be conquered. He can never be anything but what he is, a free person in space. His adjustments are the gracious gesture of one who recognizes what is necessary and does it. But never for a moment is he captured by the delusion of the world in which he lives. This does not mean that he will not be a good father, or a good teacher, or a good businessman, or a good employee. He will be all of these things just as he was before and better. As a parent, he will have the time, the insight to watch and lead his family constructively. As a friend, he will be a true friend without ulterior motive. And as an employee, he will give an honest day's work. These things are fundamental. Without these things, we have no religion. And when we begin to practice the motion of consciousness from within ourselves, realizing a divine life abiding in us, we do not need any other religion. The problem is to get our spiritual insight into action. And before we can, we have to clarify it. And the only way we can clarify it is quietly experience through the illusions of matter and become dynamically aware of this tremendous eternity that is within us. Then thinking in terms of that which is our true self, that which is our inevitable self, that which is the being with which we must live, not now but forever, we can then begin to put our material affairs in order, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but not rendering unto Caesar the things that are God's. That we will do all things as well as we can and better every day, but we will not create false allegiances either in our personal thinking or in our collective careers. We will weigh everything and cling to that which is good. But to do this, we have to have quietude. We have to be able to sit down and examine value, to understand, to search, to feel, to experience, to know, and to put the wonderful experiences of the inner life above the confusion and crashing of outer existence. So Zen simply tells us that it's time to sit down, be quiet, and find out what the universe wants of man. And that unless we do this, we are going to be in trouble. And it doesn't make any difference whether we're in the east or west. We're still going to be in trouble. And it doesn't make any difference whether we overwhelm communism or communism overwhelms us. Communism is just another name for the eternal adversary that must always arise as long as man's own conduct is inadequate. When we ruin the world, something comes along. It is not the thing that is coming that is the true cause of our problem. The cause of our problem is that we have permitted the world to get into such a condition that these violent situations arise. The answer is to prevent them by having a world that is already in order, having a life that is already in order, so that comes what will, we are still able to face it with understanding, integrity, and insight. And on the basis of this type of thinking, I think Dr. Suzuki has a message for us. And I think in terms of world need, he is desperately hoping that something will happen to bring this message home, because the disaster that might destroy us will also destroy his people. We are bound together now in one great unity. No one unit of this pattern can fail without involving the disaster to the whole. And it is essential that East and West, we begin to think in terms of basic value, putting that which is necessary first, and burying forever those prejudices, conceits, and deceits from which we have so long suffered in that pit which was to be the final abode of the Prince of Perdition. We have to build straight now in our own thinking and in our own living. And straight thinking and living begins with the leisure within ourselves to sit down and think things through, and then to have the courage to apply these inward discoveries to the conduct of our outward affairs. Time is up.